Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're on part 27 today. I'm going to look at the topic of the papacy, a topic that has been put off for a couple of weeks now, but today we'll spend all of our time looking at this. It's interesting to look at the ancient origins of the idea of a pope. The papacy, along with monasticism, gave unity and continuity to the Middle Ages. So those two organizations really are what kept this Western part of what used to be the Roman Empire together, kept the knowledge of the ancient ways, at least kept it from being lost, and really became the center of the culture. The word pope means father. In early times, it was used to refer to any respected bishop. So any bishop that was in a position of great authority or respectability, just a bishop that people really had a lot of respect for, they would just call him father. The term didn't have, obviously, the same connotation we look at today for the person that we call the Pope. And as we know, in the West, it eventually was reserved for the bishops of Rome. In the East, it continued to be used with more liberality. So continued to be used more like it had been traditionally to refer to any respected bishop, anybody that was in a really authoritative position as a bishop or a church leader. Whereas in the West, it became exclusive of the bishops of the Church of Rome. So what about the Bishop of Rome? It's not altogether clear how the Bishop of Rome came to enjoy the authority of the papacy. We know that most scholars agree Peter visited Rome, and there's a high probability he died there. Don't know a lot about his interactions at the Roman Church, or even that he really had any position there, but I know enough to at least know that he was probably in Rome, almost certainly there, and very likely died there. Looking back at the various lists of early bishops of Rome, they don't all agree with each other. There are some that have a different order for when the bishops came. It's a little curious that lists that were around basically during the same time period shouldn't have really been that far off, and yet they weren't in agreement. One possible theory of why that might be is that early on the church at Rome operated with a group of bishops who jointly led. It's a possibility, a speculation. We don't really know that to be the case. But regardless of that, it's true that in the early centuries, the churches in the East were more important than the church at Rome. So one of the things that I hope you're getting through this study is that early on, Christianity was dominated by what was going on in the Eastern world. Today, we know that's not the case. And we talked a little bit about some of the reasons for why that happened last week. We'll talk about it even more as we continue to go through this study. But the Western world, the churches in the West, they were definitely not as esteemed as the churches in the East. But even in the West, the theological leadership was in North Africa. Alexandria was the seat of learning, and that's where we got people like Tertullian, who was one of the great early church theologians. They weren't coming from Rome. The church in Rome didn't have the high prestige that you would look at as being the place that the Pope, the person that's in charge of the whole church, would be at. If there was any position like that at the time, which there was not, that would have been somebody in the East. Or if it was somebody in the West, it would have been someone in Northern Africa, most likely. And the reason that this change happened was the barbarian invasions and the fall of the Roman Empire. It all changed when the barbarian invasions came in. The empire in the East continued for another 1,000 years. We know the Byzantine Empire, what was the surviving part of the ancient Roman Empire, it continued on for quite a while, but the western part became fragmented because of these invasions. And because of that, the West became reliant on the church to preserve the ancient civilization. The position and the place of the church in the Western world became much, much more important. It became very vital to people. And so obviously church leadership was going to take a more authoritative role in society because of the need that people had to have this organization help to preserve the ancient civilization and give some stability in a very chaotic time. As a result of this, the most prestigious bishop in the West, which was the Roman bishop, became the focal point for unity. So it's not hard to see with the development of the changes that happened with the fall of the western part of the Roman Empire, the invasion of all these different groups that fragmented that area into different places, chaos that brought, the need for someone to come in and offer some kind of stability. The church took that place, and so whoever was the person that had the highest role in the church was going to have a lot more authority. And that did become, in the Western world, the Roman bishop. So let's talk about one of these. Leo the Great is said to be the first pope in the modern sense. So what's meant by that is the first one who you would look at as being the leader, the head of the church. So by saying pope, we're not talking about just a respected leader or somebody that you're looking at as father, a title of respect for someone in a high prestigious position, but that actual person that has that power, that authority, that pope, that person that's the head of the church. Leo the Great would be the first one in that modern sense. In the East, his influence was significant, but ultimately powerless. What we're going to look at next week is what's the development of the church in the East, and we're going to find that there are the continuing theological debates, the heretical positions. There's just a series of these that continue to go on in the East. Leo the Great's opinion about these things didn't hold any, it didn't matter. They didn't care about that. He didn't have a whole lot of power, a whole lot of sway. He had a significant position, but when it came right down to it, he was ultimately powerless. Not so in the West. In the West, Leo gained his power because of military action. And this happened in AD 452 when Italy was invaded by Attila and his Huns. We know him from history for sure. Leo left Rome and marched to meet Attila. No one knows what was said in that meeting, but Attila decided not to attack Rome and died shortly thereafter. Now, nobody knows what was said, but that doesn't mean people didn't speculate. And again, remember, this is that Middle Ages time, that medieval time. There's a lot of superstitious notions going on. And one of the ideas that came about was that Attila saw Leo coming, marching to him, and he looked and he saw St. Peter and St. Paul striding side by side with Leo, and that scared him, and he knew he couldn't attack Rome. And again, these stories, you get a lot of these. We're going to see more of the influence of this superstitious time as we go through this, but just one example of that. We'll get more and more craziness as we go through looking at this time period. Next, Leo led negotiations with the Vandals, who sacked Rome in AD 455. He couldn't stop the invasion from happening, but he was able to convince them not to burn the city. So there was still a city standing when it was all said and done. And again, this gave him a lot of authority because of the leadership that he gave. Now, you made me wonder, why weren't there civil leaders at this time? Well, there were, but they weren't doing anything. They were rendered powerless by their own inaction or just because of the way things were at the time. And Leo stepped in and he kind of took this position of being not just the religious leader, but also the civil leader. Well, that cements his authority even more. And Leo started really thinking pretty highly of his position. He came to believe that Jesus had made Peter and his successors the rock on which the church was to be built. By extension, that meant the Bishop of Rome, Peter's direct successor, is the head of the church. And in Leo's writings, we find all the traditional arguments for papal authority. They developed right here with this guy. He did a lot of good. Not going to criticize him at all, because in a leadership gap, when the people needed someone to step in and save them, he did it not once but twice. And so he earned the right to have the authority he did. But then, as we'll see with these guys, they start bringing in these notions, and because they are in the positions they are in and people are dependent on them, they go along with it. And here we get the idea of papal authority not just being because he's at a prestigious church, or even if you want to look at it as being the most important church in the Western Empire, but it's because of a line from Peter that's hard to establish historically, but yet in Leo's writings we find these arguments. Well, next on the timeline of history, we see that there is a schism that's developing between the West and the East. In AD 476, the last Western emperor was deposed, and Italy entered a long period of chaos. Now, technically, Italy was now part of the Eastern Roman Empire, but there was constant tensions between the popes and the Eastern emperors. Theological controversies led to a schism between the East and the West. These theological controversies that were going on in the East bled over to the West, and by AD 498, there were two rival popes, one supported by the Arian Ostrogoths and one supported by Constantinople, which would have been Orthodox. This led to violent riots in the streets of Rome. Eventually, after a series of synods, the conflict was resolved. That process begins a series of events that leads to a power shift. Hormisdas became pope in AD 514, and under his leadership, the schism with Constantinople ended. But that didn't mean everything was great for the church in the West, because it came during a resurgence of power in the Eastern Empire under Justinian. And Justinian was of the opinion that the church needed to be completely subject to the state, and that's the way it was in the East, and he sought to make it that way in the West. Of course, they resisted, but this was a time of conflict again. The next few popes were merely puppets of Justinian and his empress Theodora. We see here this idea of separation of church and state. The state doesn't need to be in the affairs of the church, and the church doesn't need to be in the affairs of the state. And it seems like that's what happened one way or the other all through this time. That's going to shift here relatively soon. But for now, these popes are they're doing whatever Justinian and Theodora tell them. Upon Justinian's death in AD 565, Byzantine power began to wane, and Constantinople withdrew its army from Italy. And I didn't mean that overnight the Eastern Empire had no more say in the popes and what they were doing. You'll find that's not the case. It took a little while to come out of this, but the shift is starting to happen now. The Lombards invaded Italy. The popes became responsible for preserving Rome. The Eastern Empire is not helping them anymore. They had their own problems. They were gone, largely. And so the western part of the old Roman Empire is having to do things itself, and particularly Italy and Rome. They had to find a way to protect themselves from these invading armies. Pope Benedict I died in AD 579 during a siege of Rome by the Lombards. His successor, Pope Pelagius II, saved Rome by buying off the Lombards. So here again, a church leader is having to come in and do the civic duty that a leader should have been doing, a governmental leader. Largely during this time, it's the church and the popes that are doing this work. Power for the state and the church began shifting to the pope. You can see why. Soon an alliance with the Franks would lead to them being the main support of the papacy. So we'll see more of this as we go through. We won't look as much of that today. We'll brush through it. But before we really can go forward with this, we need to look at one of the most important popes that came along for a lot of reasons, and certainly one that's very important for this time period. And that is Pope Gregory. Gregory was born in Rome around 540 AD. After years of neglect and repeated sieges, Rome was in a state of chaos and mismanagement at this time. Many of the ancient monuments and buildings were destroyed so that they could use the stones to repair the wall. It's great to have these old buildings, but if the wall's torn down and invading armies can just come in, it's not going to matter if we have them anyway. So they had a choice to make, and it really wasn't a choice at all. They had to do it. So they tore them down and used the stones to repair the walls. Not only that, but the aqueducts and the drainage system had fallen into disrepair. And as a result of that, disease was rife all over the place. That's what the city that Gregory grew up in. It was a beleaguered place. It was a place that he knew and other people knew somebody needed to come in and try to fix these problems. Well, we don't know a whole lot about Gregory's early life, but we do know that he became a deacon under Pope Benedict. And as such, he acted as a member of Benedict's administrative council. So he's rising up the ranks. Pope Pelagius II appointed Gregory his ambassador before the court at Constantinople, so he had to actually leave Rome and go to Constantinople. He was the direct representative of Pelagius there in the Eastern Empire, in Constantinople. But in AD 586, Gregory returned and became abbot to his monastery in Rome, so he's called back in. At that time, Rome was being threatened by the Lombards. There was an epidemic that broke out in Rome, and floods had destroyed much of the store of food, so things were not really that great in Rome. There's a lot of problems. And once again, the church leadership has to rise up and help. So Pope Pelagius had organized the sanitation of the city. He helped organize the burial of the dead and the feeding of the hungry, and throughout all that work, he became ill and he died. And guess what? Gregory was named Pope against his wishes. Where have we heard this before? It just seems like as we go through this, there are so many of these guys who were given leadership positions that they didn't want. And you can tell why he wouldn't want it now. It wasn't just because he was being humble. This is not a great position to be in because you're in charge of trying to fix all these problems and you have no help to do it. The Eastern Empire is not coming in to help you. They're not bringing armies. They're not bringing supplies. They're not bringing nothing. You have nobody. You are on your own. And there's no civil leadership to help you. You are the guy that's going to have to fix all of this. Nobody wanted to be Pope. Nobody was looking for this position, and Gregory got it, and he didn't want it. In fact, he didn't want it so much, he tried to get Constantinople to have his election annulled. The reason for this is, even though popes were being named by the church in Rome, they had to be approved by the Eastern Empire in Constantinople. He tried to have his election annulled, but they approved him as Pope. So eventually, reluctantly, he said, okay, I'm going to be Pope. And as, again, with these other ones we've talked about, once they went ahead and took those positions, they took it seriously. First of all, Pope Gregory had to become a civic leader. He knew this. He organized distribution of food among the needy in Rome. They needed food. Nobody else was going to help, and so he did it. He supervised the rebuilding of the aqueducts and the defenses of the city, so that was very important. Try to get some of this disease out, trying to get the water flowing again, and then let's get the city defended. The garrison was drilled until morale was restored, so they got the army back up and running good. Then Gregory secured peace via negotiations with the Lombards. So the Lombards were the ones coming in, invading Italy. He got some peace with them. He got a little truce going with them. So by default, the Pope had become the acting ruler of Rome. So now we see the other side of the coin. The state can have too much say in the church's activities, but then the church can have too much say in the state's activities. In this instance, you can't really criticize the church for that. These guys weren't looking to take over. They weren't looking to try to be rulers of the state. Pope Gregory didn't want the position. He didn't want to have to handle this stuff, but he knew he was going to have to do it. Nobody else is doing it. If there's nobody else that's going to do it, the person that is going to do it is going to be looked at in high esteem, and they're going to be put up on a big pedestal. And he was. And it's not unfair. It's not anything that he was at fault for. It's just the way it happened. And he became the de facto acting ruler of Rome. So a lot of power is coming into this position now. A lot of power that doesn't just have to do with power of the church, it is power of the state, of government. It's coming into this position that is supposed to be a church leadership role. At this time, Rome and the surrounding areas soon became known as St. Peter's Patrimony. Eventually, in the 8th century, a document was forged which falsely claimed Constantine had granted these lands to St. Peter's successors. It didn't happen. It's no truth in it whatsoever, but somebody just came up with a document. Oh, look what I found. And here we go. Regardless, this is the beginning of them gaining this territory for the church, these positions that bleed over not just to the church leadership, but to the governmental leadership, civic leadership, that happened because of the need for somebody to take this role on and the willingness of the Pope to do it. Well, Gregory considered himself above all of these things a religious leader. He was reluctantly doing the other stuff. He felt like his position was to be a religious leader, and it was. And he did some good things with this, and then he did some not so good things with this, at least in my opinion. He preached constantly among the various churches in Rome. That's great. He didn't just stay in one place. He wasn't an elevated person that, I'm too good to go out and preach among the people. He was out there. He went to the churches. He preached. He was very instrumental in preaching the word of God to people, and some of his own ideas too, as we'll see. But he was doing the right thing there. That was the way it should be. He took measures to promote clerical celibacy, which was slowly becoming the norm in Italy, although a lot of the bishops and monks and priests said they were celibate and really weren't. On paper, they took that position, but they didn't really practice it. Well, Gregory came in and kind of turned the tables on that and said, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do it. Now, again, look at this. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Different people have different ideas here. We know that this became normal for leadership in the Catholic Church to be celibate. Has it always been a great thing that that's the case? I think you can make an argument that it hasn't been. There's some good parts to it too. So is it necessary for a minister of a church, a person in a key position, to be celibate? Gregory thought that it was, and he's one of the big proponents of this. He didn't originate it, but he definitely helped to promote it. Gregory was also instrumental in converting King Ricaret of Spain to Nicene Catholicism. So here's another good thing. He's getting this king out of Arianism, out of heretical thinking, to become Orthodox. So he's doing a good thing on that one. And then he sent Augustine's mission to England, extending the authority of Rome to the British Isles. So he's promoting the church over in Great Britain and the British Isles. Nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. So he's doing a lot of good. A couple of things that are kind of questionable so far. But then Gregory was also a prolific writer whose works were very influential throughout the Middle Ages. And here's where we come into a little bit of problems, at least from a Protestant perspective, which that is the perspective I'm coming at this from. Obviously, from a Catholic perspective, you wouldn't see it this way necessarily. Probably wouldn't at all. But here's where we start to see the introduction of some ideas that we'll be very familiar with. We're seeing where they come into play. And it starts with Pope Gregory and Augustine. In his writings, Gregory did not seek to be original, but to affirm the teachings of great leaders of the past. Another good idea. There's nothing new under the sun, the Bible says. You don't need to come up with a bunch of new thinking when it comes to theology. That's where we get all this heretical teaching from. So Pope Gregory said he wasn't trying to come up with new stuff. He was just reaffirming what had been from the past. Well, that certainly seems to be his intention, but not necessarily the way it played out. But that certainly was what he was going for. And his favorite guy was Augustine. When we talked about Augustine, the statement that was made is he was the most influential theologian for the Western Church, period, or at least since the time of Paul, the writings of Paul. One of the reasons why is so many church leaders past the time of Augustine have loved his writings and they have promoted his teachings. And this is definitely the case here. One of the big proponents that brought this out through the Middle Age time was Pope Gregory. Gregory actually so admired Augustine that he took his speculations and affirmed them. This is not a good thing. We know that a lot of these early theologians and church writers, apologists, they would speculate a lot of different things, and they would come out and say, this is just me speculating. This is just me thinking out loud. Here's something that might be. Maybe not necessarily the greatest thing in the world, but at least you're saying this is not biblical, this is not authoritative, this is just me thinking out loud. Or here's a possibility of what might be the case. Well, one example of that is the doctrine of purgatory. It wasn't called that, but it became the doctrine of purgatory, and it's from Augustine. Augustine had suggested the possibility of a place for the purification of those who died in sin. So the idea here was that there would be a place that you would go to. You were saved, you were going to be in heaven, but you weren't quite ready to be there. There might be some purification of sin that needed to happen. You might need to do this, that, or whatever to deal with some sin from your past. And so he said, hey, wait a minute. Maybe there's a place that people go to. Maybe there's a place and it's totally just God's plan to get them ready for heaven. And it was speculation on his part. He never taught that authoritatively, that was scriptural or in any way divinely inspired or even a theology that we should have. You see where the danger of having that kind of speculation comes in, because somebody's going to come along and either misunderstand or just misrepresent your thinking and say, well, this is the way it is. And that's what happened. Gregory so admired Augustine that he took this idea and said, well, if Augustine said it, that's good enough for me. And he affirmed the existence of such a place. So here's the Pope, the person of high authority in the church. He's telling people there is a purgatory. There is this place that sinners go, sinners that have been saved but still have sin that hadn't been dealt with. There's a place that they go that they have to get ready to go to heaven. They have to get purified. An idea that was not an original teaching of the church. If you'll remember, one of the big arguments the Catholic Church had against heretical teaching was that they had a direct line of teaching from Jesus to his disciples to their direct disciples all the way down the line. Well, guess what? None of this stuff had anything to do with anything that they taught. It had never been in the church before. Augustine came hundreds of years later and had an idea pop in his head that he thought might be a possibility, and now all of a sudden it's becoming church doctrine. This is a very interesting time in history because you're in this medieval time that you got a lot of superstition going on, and people are susceptible of believing things that maybe necessarily they wouldn't have done before just because the right person said it. You have to decide how you feel about that, what you believe. Just understand this was not an original teaching of early Christianity. You can't find it anywhere. You'll never find it anywhere. It starts with Augustine, his speculation, and then now it's going to be sent out as being actually the case. Now, as for salvation, Gregory set aside the Augustinian doctrines of predestination and irresistible grace. It's funny, all these guys that loved Augustine so much, they didn't like these two doctrines. They didn't like the predestination. They didn't like irresistible grace. They threw them to the side. And it wasn't just Gregory that did this. That was pretty much the way. The guys that came after Augustine that promoted his teachings typically would either just minimize it, not talk about it, ignore it, whatever it is. They didn't go with this. But instead, Gregory advocated the idea of penance, which consists of contrition, confession, and punishment or satisfaction. So a way of dealing with sin that you commit after coming to God, coming to Christ. You have to satisfy God's need for justice. So you can't just sin and it's gone. You have to do something about it. There has to be this process. And Gregory's advocating this, but then he's adding to it too. And he adds to it priestly absolution. So those who die without having offered satisfaction for all their sins must go to purgatory before they go to heaven. Now understand what's being said here. The satisfaction for the sins is God's satisfaction. He has to be satisfied that the sins have been dealt with, you've received the proper punishment or whatever it is, in order for that not to be on your tally anymore, however you want to put that. But now what Gregory is doing is he's adding an added layer to that. It has to go through the church. So it's not just you and God taking care of that together. There has to be a priest involved offering absolution. So that you go through getting things right with God, but you don't just do it independently. You have to satisfy it through the church. So if you want to get to heaven without going to purgatory, you have to have priestly absolution. If you don't, you go there. But that's not all that can be done. The living can help the dead out of purgatory by offering masses in their favor. The reason that this teaching came along is because Gregory taught that in the Mass, Christ was sacrificed anew. And so with a new and fresh sacrifice of Jesus Christ comes the renewal of the offer of absolution of sin. And so if you as a living person were to help your friend or your loved one that's in purgatory, you can go to Mass and in their place or in their favor, and you can help them out. They're going to get another shot. That's going to help them get out of purgatory by you doing this. So this, again, listen, remember this. These ideas originated at this time. These were not teachings that the church ever had before. You can't find any historical reference for these ideas about purgatory, the need for priestly absolution, and the idea that in the Mass, Christ is crucified anew, sacrificed anew. Now, am I telling you that you can't believe that if you want to? You absolutely can. If you think it's true and you don't think that it's important that it was an original Christian teaching, then you can do that. But just understand this is where it comes from. It's coming at this time. The role of the Pope becomes elevated to the point that they can go ahead and introduce these new things, and that's okay. That is in keeping with teachings of the church. But up until this point, with the rise of the Pope, it had always been the position of the church that the authoritative teachings came from Jesus and his direct disciples that passed them down through a succession of their followers. And now we're starting to see that you can add on to that as well. When it was added on in a way the church didn't approve of, they called it heresy. When it was added on as a way that the church did approve of, it just became part of the doctrine of the Catholic Church. So we're not going to all agree on it, but we can't agree on the history because the history is indisputable. This is what happened. So these teachings became standard doctrine of the Western Church until they were rejected by the Protestants in the 16th century. The teachings were a product of the superstition and obscurantism of the Middle Ages. What's meant by that is these ideas were being introduced into the way people thought, and they were being accepted by people at that time because they were very superstitious. They weren't being told the truth necessarily about everything, and they believed these leaders. And again, we can look back on them and judge them and think, oh, you're so dumb. Why didn't you stand up against this? Why? Look, these are people, this Pope Gregory is saving people's lives. They are able to have a home because of him. They're able to have food in their mouths because of him. They're able to have clean water to drink because of him. When that's your position and there's nobody else to help you and there's one person that's taking that role on, you're going to listen to them. And that's absolutely understandable. It's human nature. And Gregory was not trying to do anything wrong. Some people would say he didn't do anything wrong. Others would say, well, we don't agree with the teaching. Regardless of that, this is a guy who's trying to help people. He was a great leader, and he deserves to be respected for what he did. We can disagree with him, but he brought these teachings along, and they became standard doctrine in the Western Church. Eventually, the Protestants rejected these teachings, and that's how we got the split between the Catholic Church, Orthodox Catholic Church, and the Protestant Church that came along in the 16th century. So Gregory's successors were under the authority of Eastern rulers for a time. This pulling away and gaining independence didn't happen overnight. It was a process. But that time did end with Pope Gregory III in AD 731. So finally the popes got out from under the Eastern authority. They didn't have Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire no longer had the right to run these guys the way they wanted to. And that happened officially, or you can look at historically, with Pope Gregory III in AD 731. From that time on, the popes gained more and more power until in AD 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the West. So you're looking at a total reversal from the church being under the thumb of the emperor to now the Pope is the one who's crowning the rulers of the West. A total change, two sides of the same coin though. Not good either way. That you've got too much of the state and the church. It flips now again, and it keeps going back and forth in history. Now the church has too much say in the affairs of the state. So same coin, different sides of it. It's flipped now. And the popes have gained a lot of power. They've earned it. We can criticize it, but they've earned it. They stood up when nobody else was there, and they kept this thing going. You do that, you gained yourself a lot of capital with people, and rightly so. You look at these early rulers, you look at these early leaders, you look at these early popes. We can criticize them, whether you're Protestant or Catholic or not any of that stuff, whatever. We can criticize them, but we have to, again, look back at the time in which they lived and give credit where credit is due. These guys, they stood up, they kept Western civilization going when it could have easily fallen in complete and total decay. It was already bad enough as it was. And they were the ones that the people looked to because they were the ones who were faithful through this time to help people and to carry on the civilization and the culture. So you can't really look back on them. Despite the things that you might want to say I don't like or I don't agree with, you can't look back on them with anything more than respect because they did what they had to do. And we'll see this as we go through. Now, next week, we're going to move away from the West, and we're going to go back to the Eastern Church. We've referenced it time and time again. A lot of different stuff that you've heard even today about the Western view of what was going on. We're going to look at the Eastern Church specifically. And with that, we're going to see how the government did have a lot of authority still in shaping the affairs of the church, and how that helped to lead to there being mass problems with doctrinal and theological issues and issues of heresy that bled over even into the West at times. So we'll look at that next week, and just another picture of what's going on in the history of Christianity. Thanks again for spending time with me today. Really enjoyed getting to talk about this with you. Hope that you enjoyed it as well, and hope that you have a very blessed week, and looking forward to being with you again next week. God bless.